don't think I really need to go much into today's events. I know, both of our speakers will touch on it. I'm sure we'll discuss it in the discussion. But what a important time for a book like this that looks at the radical Jewish tradition to come out. So, look, just to explain how this meeting's going to run, we've got two fantastic speakers. I'll introduce them one by one, who will speak one after the other, and then we'll have more than enough time for you to ask questions to both speakers, to make contributions. I'll probably ask you to keep your contributions just to about 3 minutes, so we can try and get as many people to come in as possible, and then we'll bring both of our speakers back, and of course there'll be plenty of time for you to browse the bookshop, buy the book most importantly, get it signed by Donny, and to ask our speakers and to talk amongst ourselves. Just to say, before I introduce our first speaker, that you will see that I'm sat with two people here today. One of them's not the author of the book, but there's a second author of the book, Janey Stone. Janey Stone, she's based in Australia, so given sort of time and hybrid elements that we don't have in the bookshop, unfortunately Janey isn't here today, but of course it's...
Okay, thanks very much. At first sight, this book looks a bit of a niche subject, Jewish radical history, 1881 to 1948. I'm going to argue that actually it is that, but actually it's got very, very immediate impact, and it deals, I think, with three important things that we're facing today. First one is the rise of the far right. The Jewish radical tradition developed to fight against the anti-Semitism and all those sorts of things. And the far right says that Jews are out to manipulate the world for their own interests. So that's the first thing that it tackles. The second thing that it tackles is the question of Israel and the claim that Israel makes that it stands in the tradition of Jewish history, in the tradition of all Jews, forever. And I'll just read you from the 1948 Declaration of Independence of Israel. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for the return to it. Jews strove in every successive generation, we're talking about 2,000 years here, every successive generation to re-establish themselves in their ancient homeland. In other words, that's the version of Jewish history that the Israeli state would like you to believe. And it's supposed to justify what's happening at the moment in Gaza, etc. And the third reason why I think it's relevant is the argument which was made against Corbyn and is made against the left generally, that the left is anti-Jewish, it's anti-Semitic, it's inherently, and the argument goes, and it's a really bizarre argument, that because we're against capitalism, we're anti-Semitic. Now, try and get your head around that, but actually that is the argument that is put forward. Okay, how's it false? Well, the first one is that Jews do not manipulate and have not manipulated others. If you look at it, what we find in the Jewish radical tradition is quite the opposite. It's Jews together with other people, together with the mass movements against oppression and exploitation. That's what the Jewish radical tradition is. And one of the first sentences in the book is, the Jewish radical tradition is the radical tradition. There's no separation between them. We're all against capitalism, and it's not somebody using somebody else. So that's one of the things that it traces. The second thing that it does is it shows that actually, far from being yearning for 2,000 years to return to Palestine, the vast majority of Jews before the Holocaust, before the Second World War, were not interested in Zionism. Not necessarily anti-Zionist, but they just weren't interested in it. And I'll talk about that if I get the time. And the third thing is that, to address the question of is the left anti-Semitic, what you find is that every fight against anti-Semitism was fought from the left, by the left, and of course that left included Jews and non-Jews. In other words, a united fight. Okay. And on a positive point, in a sense, because those are things that it tries to challenge, what it shows is the power of the fight against exploitation and oppression when they combine. Because that is what the Jewish radical tradition is. It's a fight against both of those simultaneously fused into one thing. And what it means is that workers, non-Jewish workers, cannot be free unless they fight against oppression and oppressed Jews cannot be free unless they fight against capitalism alongside the workers. And so that's the other argument that comes from the Jewish radical tradition, I think. So where does this tradition come from? Because it didn't just drop from the skies. Very quick potted history. During European feudalism, which was basically landed society, lords at the top, peasants at the bottom, there was a gap, there was a problem, what happened in the towns? And basically in the towns, they needed a Jewish population, non-Christians, to do the commercial activities that they weren't prepared to do themselves, because they were looked down upon. They just weren't important from their point of view. And so you get that stereotyped situation where Jews were forced into a particular role in society. Along comes, really compressing this, the Black Death. And who do you need to blame for the Black Death? Well, it can't be Christians, it must be the Jews. So the Jews substantially were blamed for the Black Death in Western Central Europe, massive persecutions, and they go eastwards towards the one place which was prepared to accept them. Casimir III of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth wanted a population of people to fulfill precisely those commercial roles and the town roles and the manufacturing roles, artisan roles that were missing in Poland. So he welcomes them in. So they're living in Eastern Europe. Not everybody, of course, because Jews are spread right across the planet. But a large number, half actually, just under half, are living within an area which, when the Tsars took it over, when the Russians took it over, becomes the Pale of Settlement. This is the area where Jews are allowed to live, and nowhere else within Russia. So they're sitting there, living there from the 1790s onwards. The Pale of Settlement is controlled by the Russians, and half of the 16 million Jews in the world are there. By a pure accident of history, Russian industrialization takes off in the Pale of Settlement, in that area. It's moving from the west towards, Russia's very backward economically, but it's coming from the west. So the first place to industrialize is where the Jews happen to be living. And so you get the emergence of a Jewish working class. And you get the emergence of a division in the community between Jewish workers and Jewish employers. So you get a breakup of the Jewish community as such, and you get emergence of a mass number of people who are both oppressed, very oppressed, and exploited at the same time. And that, as I say, is the core of what the Jewish radical tradition is about. But of course, Jews aren't the only people who are suffering under Russian rule. The peasants are suffering, non-Jewish workers, and even the rising capitalists are, suffering under the Tsars. So you get a revolutionary movement against the Tsars. And in 1881, revolutionaries killed the Tsar Alexander III. They assassinated him. And the people who organised it happened to stay in a house whose landlady was a Jewish woman. And then from that point onwards, the pogroms are launched. And the pogroms swept across Russia, and they had a simple slogan: save the Tsar, beat the Jews. Save the Tsar, beat the Jews. Today we have save the bosses, stop the small boats. But it's exactly the same thinking, that divide and rule approach. And that means that it was intensified anti-Semitism, intensified violence, and the Jews fought back. The fight against exploitation and oppression takes off in a big way from that point onwards. The Jewish movement in a mass organised sense really begins when strikes, and you begin to get the Jewish Labour Bund and a whole number of organisations. So that is the start of it in sort of mass sense. I want to also talk about the subjective element of this, because, all right, you're oppressed and you're exploited. You also need to think about the solution. And Jews played an important part in that. What ideas were there? And if you look, I'm not going to name all the leaders of the revolutionary left, because there's been many of all sorts of types. So I'm going to name my third of delegates of Bolshevik Party conferences. The most extraordinary statistic I've come across is this one. In Petrograd is the capital of Russia during the First World War. Because the Pale of Settlement means most Jews are in the Pale of Settlement are in Poland, and the area, Ukraine, Belarus. In Petrograd, 0.3% of workers were Jewish. On the Petrograd Soviets, the Workers' Revolutionary Organisation, 11 out of 35 were Jewish. 1/3 of the people arrested in the 1905 revolution were Jewish. Let's move on because it's an international community. 50% of the American Communist Party in the 1920s and 30s were Jewish, when it was 1 in 40 of the American population. This one I didn't know before I started on the book, and it's not covered in the book. 1 in 4 of the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War were Jewish. South Africa, one of the most remarkable ones. In South Africa, Jews were 0.3% of the total population. Most of the population obviously was black people. 0.3% of the population. They were 2.5% of the white population. The first great trial under apartheid, it was called the Great Treason Trial, half of the whites in the room were Jewish. When Mandela was put on trial, all of the whites in the room being charged were Jewish. Now, this is not because Jews are special, it's because of that connection between fighting oppression and fighting the system. So, that in a sense is it. So, it gives you the sense of the size of it. Now, how can we compare, how can we judge this? Because I want to move on to the question of Zionism now. How much does this compare with Zionism? And obviously numbers are difficult to judge. And I'm not trying to say that there weren't other Jews. There were Orthodox Jews that sort of continued with, mainly with the religious tradition. There were assimilationist Jews who tried to pretend that they weren't really Jewish and blend in. Benjamin Disraeli springs to mind, people like that. But there was a substantial Jewish tradition, radical Jewish tradition, for a simple reason, because the majority of Jews were working class, and therefore gravitated to the left. And you saw it in the Bund organisation, huge organisation, tens and tens of thousands, etc., etc., etc. All right, so the Zionists claim that, no, that's not true. Everybody was in their tradition. Well, one way to measure it, and it's a simple way to measure it, is mass migration. Because after 1881, huge numbers of Jews just simply had to leave to save their lives. Where did they go? If you were a Zionist, you had to go. There was only one place you could go: Palestine. No alternative. If you were fleeing, that's where you go. Okay, what do the statistics show? 1 in 27 went to Palestine. 3 million went to the United States, until the United States slammed the door shut. Only really when the US stopped that did large numbers start moving into Palestine. I just want to read from Walter Laqueur, who does quite a good history. He's a Zionist himself. It's a good history of Zionism. And this is what he says about the eve of Hitler coming to power. How little had Zionism achieved in more than 3 decades? We had not won over the Jewish masses to the Zionist idea. Of 4 million American Jews, only 80,000 had voted in the Zionist elections. In Romania, 40,000. In Hungary, only 5,000 out of a Jewish community of 500,000. German Jews, the majority were actively opposed. In Britain, the majority of the community were indifferent or actively hostile. And it's worth noting that the Bund, which was it was the biggest specifically Jewish radical organisation, was actively hostile to Zionism. They hated Zionism because what they said is, you don't run away from anti-Semitism, you fight it. That's what you need to do. So that's very clear. And the final thing that I want to say on Zionism, how am I doing for time, by the way?
You're just about to hit 15 minutes, Donny.
That's good. I'm doing okay. Right. The final thing about Zionism is that actually it was a complete break from the tradition I've been describing, a complete break. And you can prove it in there's one particularly extraordinary statistic for this one. It's a question of language. The vast majority of Jews, up until recent times, it was beginning to break down with schooling, vernacular, in the vernacular language, things beginning to break down. But basically, the Jewish language was Yiddish, right? 1 in 400 spoke Hebrew. And it's important to understand, I'm talking about the end of the century, and that language had not been a language, actually, for almost 2,000 years. It was used in liturgical settings, but it was not it wasn't a language that people spoke to each other on a daily basis. 1 in 400 out of 11 million people. In 1910, Ben-Gurion, who's going to be the first Prime Minister of Israel, said, we can only use Hebrew. So, 399 out of 400 people are being excluded by what he said. And he launched what was called the language war. And the language war was to drive out and destroy Yiddish in favour of Hebrew. Where did Hebrew come from? Well, because it hadn't been used for 2,000 years, it didn't exist as a language, and there was somebody called, I forget his name, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who had to actually update the language because the words weren't there for anything that happened for the last 2,000 years. So the first monoglot was his poor son. I really feel sorry for his son because he was brought up in complete isolation from everybody else because the father didn't want him to hear other languages being spoken, in particular Yiddish. So the first monoglot was born in 1885. So this is the break that Zionism represents. It had to destroy the radical Jewish tradition. Okay. The book talks about, and I won't have time to go into it into great length, and I haven't got the last page, but I'll remember what the last page says. No, I haven't. There it is. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Yeah. I mean, the book talks about the forms of radical action, the strikes, the fight backs, all that sort of stuff. I haven't gone into that, but it goes around the world. It doesn't cover everywhere because it can't, but it travels through East End of London. It heads off to the Lower East Side of New York. It looks at Poland, it looks at Russia, it looks at Germany, etc., etc. So it covers that, but I simply haven't got time to go into it. Just a couple of things to mention. Textile workers in New York. We're about to celebrate International Women's Day. Who were the textile workers? Jews were forced into particular industries. The seamstresses, the women were women, Jewish women. They were the ones in New York that launched, in a sense, what we have as International Women's Day. Who was it that stopped fascism in this country? It was Cable Street, East End of London, not far from here. Again, Jews were part, not on their own, part of a bigger, wider socialist movement. And in the fight against racism, and I'll talk about this very, very briefly, Jews in terms of fighting against fascism and Nazism in particular. But I need to go on to what happened to the tradition at the end, because I'll be running out of time. And the tradition was almost killed off. It was killed off by three forces. The first one was Stalinism in Russia. The greatest breakthrough for Jews in the history of Jews entirely was the 1917 Russian Revolution. It was the first country to make anti-Semitism illegal. So the Russian Revolution was a fantastic breakthrough. Stalin killed the revolution, and when he killed the revolution, he also brought back anti-Semitism. So that was the first one. The idea that through uniting with other people, you know, non-Jewish workers, etc., etc., you could liberate yourself. Stalin begins putting a nail into that. Along comes, of course, the Nazis, the Holocaust. The Zionists said, everybody hates you, the only thing you can do is go to Palestine. The Holocaust comes along, and what happened? Not only does it physically kill 6 million people, most of whom would have been radical in some sort of way, but it puts a nail into the idea of solidarity. And the final nail is put in by the Allied governments. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and the rest of them. Because what happened when the Jews tried to escape from the Holocaust, from the Hitler, and all the rest of it? Every country around the world shut their doors. And so the Zionist argument suddenly, unfortunately, makes sense. And that brings you to Palestine. In other words, what happened was the nails in the coffin were brought in by anti-Semitism, by Stalinism, and by the refusal of Allied governments. And that creates the situation we have today, which I think is a tragic situation, which is the majority of Jews in this country, and in most places, are Zionists and convict Zionists because of that. But we need to remember where it came from. It came from the Stalinists, it came from the capitalist governments in the rest of the world. Stalin was a capitalist as well. And so that's very, very important. And I think I'll finish there. Apart from one thing, I just want to finish with what the book ends with. The book ends with a quote from Marek Edelman. Now, Marek Edelman was one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. He was one of the few that survived, and he wrote in the 1980s, he said, Who are the people who are the inheritors of our radical Jewish tradition? It's the Intifada. That's what he said, and I'll finish there.
The words in this book's title are words that we have needed for some time, I think. And I want to start with a kind of analogy, because recent decades have seen an explosion of discussion of something called the Black radical tradition. And perhaps since Cedric Robinson, just up the road from here at the IRR Library, was writing his Black Marxism in the early 1980s. And that tradition is defined clearly not by intellectual homogeneity, think in Britain of the vicious fights between Warnish and Hamdan, but it is defined by a common material experience, simultaneously of domination and exclusion, generating a distinctive vantage point for the critique of a wider society. So what is the Jewish experience generating Jewish radicalism? And we've heard something of it already. And just as American accounts of blackness have sometimes been criticized for centering one moment, plantation slavery, so this book is deliberately narrow, as you've just heard, in concentrating mostly on just 60 years, the 1880s to the 1940s, out of thousands of years of Jewish history, in Europe and North America. In fact, it focuses on Eastern Europe, Germany, London, and the United States up to 1945. We hear almost nothing of the Jews who founded communist parties from Iraq to Egypt to Greece, let alone pre-modern Jewish radicalisms. You know, you'll remember that Isaac Deutsch's classic Message of the Non-Jewish Jew essay begins with a medieval heretic and proceeds through Spinoza. In fact, this book covers the terrain named in one recent volume as Revolutionary Yiddish Land, another great book that people should read. So why that choice? What defines the material conditions of this lost Ashkenazi world? Two things stand out, and I'll be very brief because we've already heard something of them. First, proletarianization, the formation of a distinct Jewish working class, cohered in part by a shared language and resulting institutions of class struggle, from newspapers to parties. I feel this microphone's being very annoying. Should I try without it? Or will that be a
I think you
problem
might be alright without it.
Yeah?
So people need it for the recording.
Do we need it for the recording, do you think? I will do what I'm told.
Just make sure people in the back.
Yeah, I think.
Can everyone hear?
Yeah.
Okay. I just felt it was kind of going in and out in some annoying way. So there's proletarianization, cohered in part by a shared language, Yiddish, which gives you a set of institutions of class struggle, from newspapers to parties. You know, I used to live in New York, where there's now a fancy apartment building in the Lower East Side with huge busts of Marx and LaSalle, because it was the headquarters of the Forward, big Yiddish socialist. I mean, it still exists as a newspaper, but it's no longer socialist. It supports Hillary Clinton. But it was a Yiddish socialist newspaper, regarded even then as one of the more moderate of the Yiddish socialist newspapers. And yet it had a big bust of Marx up there on the Lower East Side. Proletarianization, and secondly, in the condition that Hannah Arendt, of course, made central to modern anti-Semitism, Jews were excluded from that central political community of modernity, the nation-state. So if ruling classes found that French and German and British workers could be removed from the transnational community of the exploited by addressing them instead as members of the community of the nation, Jews were frighteningly outside that. Think of the Dreyfus Affair. It's also how Hitler talks about us in Mein Kampf. I had to teach Mein Kampf to students, which is why I've read it, but you all should, seriously, to understand how this thinking works. Our Jewish nation was transnational, living in many countries without a state apparatus. In the moment of the Russian Revolution, communism globally distinguished itself from social democracy by its rejection of the political forms of capitalist society. Social democracy, that binary between the economics of capitalist society that you oppose and the political forms of the state that you try to work with. Communism distinguished itself by its rejection of the political forms of capitalist society above all the nation state. And so communist parties were often founded by migrant workers and others less easily included in nationalism. And Jews were central to that all over Europe and, as I said, Asia. All that came to an end in 1945, as this book stresses. So what remains? 1945 certainly seems like a rupture along triple lines of class, geopolitics, and ideology, right? Jews, increasing Jewish prosperity and the importance of Israel as an imperialist ally transformed Jews in many ruling class imaginaries into loyal subjects. Think about how we're wielded in the armory of the British ruling class today to attack Muslims and so on. It's kind of protected minority of Western civilization, right? But I've started to wonder in that moment how much has really changed. Abraham Leon, who's briefly mentioned here, famously talked about Jews in the Tsarist Empire as a kind of buffer between popular discontent and the Tsarist state. So, faced with discontent, the Tsar would use Cossacks and Black Hundreds to turn that rage on the Jews. Isn't that sort of what Israel is? It's a little Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism, was how Richard Storrs, Britain's colonial governor of Jerusalem, called it. In the most crucial region for global trade, right by the Suez Canal, right by massive oil supplies, Britain and then American imperialism need a fortress protecting and projecting their interests. And how perfect that the Jews could be used to police and die for those interests in the region. This is to make Jews, in the words of one rabbi I love very much, cannon fodder for imperialism. A better phrase, and a phrase we've heard recently, might be human shields. In fact, Zionism makes us human shields twice over. Israel is the human shield for Western imperialism in West Asia, and by its constant and aggressive association of its violence with Judaism and Jewishness, it puts our symbols on everything it does. The Zionist state consciously makes Jews around the world its human shields, blamed and attacked by anti-Semites every time Israel murders Palestinians. So although our world might seem very different from the one described in the middle chapters of this book, in fact, the choice before us, and certainly the choice before radical Jews, remains quite similar. Or perhaps in a strange irony, it is today the choice faced by the Tsar's Cossacks, runaway serfs who were offered security if they acted as mercenaries for the imperial state. That's the position, the conditional security offered to Jews today. As you'll know if you've read Sholokov's great novel about the Cossacks, Quiet Flows the Don, in the moment of the Russian Revolution, the Cossacks were forced to choose. Would they continue in this tragic predicament where the shaky offer of safety came only through being entangled with imperial violence? Or would they unite with others, dominated in different ways by that system, to end it in the name of universal freedom? It is very hard to leave that promise of shaky security behind, but it is still worth us understanding that the conditional safety offered by ruling classes is still a form of using Jews for their own ends. And so we come to Gaza. There is no distinctively Jewish tradition involved in firing live ammunition at a crowd of hundreds of people, starving people, while they rush desperately for rice. There is no Jewish tradition involved in that. There are episodes of Jewish history that I'm reminded of when I see those images. Just as I'm reminded of Jewish history when I see Israeli soldiers taunting Palestinians as they humiliate them, or calling Palestinians human animals. All of those things do remind me of Jewish history. How to make sense of Jews doing such things? We shouldn't be so shocked. For one thing, as Primo Levi put it, Auschwitz was not a university. Trauma is not some cleansing, educative thing. But there's a deeper truth. Zionism is an attempt to cast off the skin of Jewish radicalism documented here by abolishing its material conditions. Above all, standing outside the European world of violent colonial nation states. The mistake in the anti-Semitic reading of Israeli violence is, among other things, the failure to see how Goyish Israel is, how typical of European, dare I say it, Christian, settler colonial pathologies. You know, today colonized people are besieged and bombed and starved in Gaza. The United Nations says people are being starved in Gaza more quickly today than in any other famine region they've ever seen in the world. Well, that's because the United Nations postdates the famine that Britain caused in Ireland and postdates the famine that Britain caused in Bengal. This is not new and distinctive. It is the fate that colonized people have known everywhere. And the culprit is not Jews, it's a thing called Western civilization. Western civilization was founded through its hatred of Jews. Remember, some of us still haven't forgotten or forgiven. They said we killed their God. It took them until the 1960s, by the way, for the Vatican to change its mind that all Jews currently living could be held collectively responsible for the murder of the first century pacifist they mistakenly believed was a god. That was the founding condition of Western civilization. And Zionism says to that Western civilization, tragically, if you can't beat them, join them. That's the Zionist position. The great Yiddish songwriter Daniel Kahn sums up the appeal of Zionism: who wouldn't want to win when all we'd ever done was lose? Who wouldn't want to win a shaky, false kind of victory? Great, a shaky, false kind of victory that comes through joining a civilization that can only defend itself through an increasingly genocidal lurch into violence. Perhaps most scandalously, they've conscripted the Jewish past to their colonial brutality. And that's why this book is really so important. Because in constructing, as Donny just said, in constructing a story of Jewish continuity leading up to the foundation of the State of Israel, a rewritten, lachrymose Jewish history of nothing but anti-Semitic persecution where everyone everywhere wanted to hate us, and so coalitions were always impossible, and the only answer was to escape and to kill other people before they kill us. A series of Jewish histories written in this vein. Some of you will have encountered Simon Sharma's useless and awful History of the Jews. They conscripted dead Jews to this colonial project, including 6 million murdered people who cannot speak back, and most of whom went to their deaths never having been Zionists. Walter Benjamin in that moment said, even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, and this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. That's what Zionism has done. So when they say to Western civilization, if you can't beat them, join them, I want to finish with this rallying cry that I think we've seen on the demonstrations I've been so proud to be involved in recent months with many, many people who represent the real legacy of the Jewish radical tradition. People, most of them from many of them from migrant populations, who have ended up in this country without having particularly wanted to be here, but who've ended up in this country because they've had to come to the place where the jobs were and the wealth was, much of that wealth stolen from people all over the world. People in migrant populations here who don't have clear or firm roots, but who know that the only country that can be theirs is the future, a country of freedom for everyone. Those are the people who've poured onto the streets in solidarity with Palestine, and I've been proud of the Jews. I've been one of them who's joined those demonstrations. From the killing fields of Gaza, we must today redouble the commitment that Jewish radicals long ago made, which is this. We will not join the ruling norms of Western civilization. We will link up with others from all over the world, and from London to Palestine, in the name of our ancestors, we won't join them, we'll beat them. Thanks so much.
And I was brought up kind of culturally a Jew. I mean, it's kind of quite an important thing that we do every year, which is have a Passover celebration. I mean, I think Passover and the sorts of things that are said on that Passover celebration need to be looked at. It's kind of very problematic. But all those celebrations all those festivities, all those things that I've lived through makes me think that I will call myself Jewish, I think.
I just wanted to say, I think we are in a really, really difficult situation at the moment around anti-Semitism, because there is this toxic combination. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I've been Jewish all my life, but I didn't become politically Jewish in terms of my identity, that I've got to look at the history and read about the Holocaust and actually argue about this stuff until what happened to Corbyn. And that weaponisation of anti-Semitism to attack the left made me realise that anyone who was an anti-Zionist socialist Jew actually had to stand up and be counted and actually point the finger where the... I'm not saying, I mean, bigotry runs through society. What did Marx say? The ruling ideas of any epoch are those of the ruling class. So there will be anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It'll be across the board. But actually, that is not what was going on with Corbyn. What was going on with Corbyn was an establishment that would do anything to keep a socialist out of number 10. And it wasn't that Starmer is in the pay of Zionists, and it wasn't the Israeli lobby and all those things that came with that. The second problem we have is obviously the brutality of the Israeli state. And there is a spike in anti-Semitism every time. And I'm a teacher, and I do assemblies, and I have to do... Jews in London are not responsible for what the Israeli government do, in the same way that Muslims in Saudi Arabia, Muslims in London are not responsible for what Saudi Arabia does in Yemen. So that's a really terrible thing in terms of rise of anti-Semitism. And the last thing is the real rise of anti-Semitism on the right. And everyone in this room will know this. But every time they mention the Great Replacement Theory, it's brown people on boats, Muslims, etc., replacing it. But who's organising it? The Jews are organising it. And therefore, we are in a really tricky situation where we have to be clear as hell about where anti-Semitism comes from, why we fight all forms of bigotry to unite our side at all times. We build the Palestinian movement and we fight against racism.
Refugees are welcome here, and I was at Mile End Tube Station handing out the leaflets, and it was wet and I was being a bit miserable about it, and all of a sudden I started shouting, fight anti-Semitism, fight Islamophobia, fight all forms of racism. And what then happened was really quite interesting. a number of white people turned round and came and got the leaflet. And one guy said to me, he said, "You really mean this about fighting anti-Semitism?" And it really made me think. And partly also following on from, Anna spoke at the East London March last Saturday, and the way she's spoken today, is that I think we also have to understand that there is a reality about, and I'm not Jewish, right, about Jewish people who support Israel feeling corralled by the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, which we actually have to understand. And therefore, when I started shouting, stand up to anti-Semitism, stand up to Islamophobia, unite against it, that got a resonance. And interestingly, we were leafleting at the East London Mosque at lunchtime, and there were several people who stopped to talk about the fact that we actually were wanting to create unity over the question of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And so I think that question of us being central to uniting over that fight and fighting over the two fights and bringing them together is really, really important. I don't know whether other people have had similar.
It's true, but it's just as a contribution to all the question and the great speech so far. I was wondering if in this tradition, I personally have I'm a bit not at ease with the concept of identity as a monolithic thing, and with the question earlier when we talked about the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi element of the great Jewish tradition. So I wonder if, and I'm surrounded here by the memoir of an Arab Jew, Avi Schleim. I'm also thinking about Judah Magnus, the former chancellor of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So there is also a great tradition within the Jewish heritage that effectively can see through the monolithic idea of a Jewish identity. And I wonder, Anna Arendt, she was ostracized by her own community. So I wonder if, for example, thinking of the concept of anti-Semitism, if we look at the Semitic languages, they unite Hebrew and Arabic languages. So I wonder if a way forward, and I would like to know what you think, we can start thinking in a way that we can see something in common between the great Jewish tradition, the Arab tradition, Palestine. We can start broadening the spectrum. As I said, I haven't thought it through. I kind of dotted my contribution with some prominent figure. I wonder if these, spark something.
Because I'm, an activist in my union and a branch in a national level, and obviously been doing a lot of campaigning around Palestine. We've had it running through everything we've done in our union branch for the last few months. Every single week we've had union meetings where we've talked about Palestine. We had, on the last Workplace Day of Action, we had a little ceasefire now thing outside the front of the main council building with the union banner and what have you. And, we had, it's really interesting because one of the things we've found is management silencing, actually, what we try and do, and being a block on it. So when we wanted to do our Workplace Day of Action, I don't think I've had to spend so much time in the company of senior management who were trying to get me to call it off because it was going to intimidate people. Because one of the things that we said, as well as having the little protest, was, and it came as a request from one of our Palestinian members when we were discussing ideas of what to do, was, like workplaces have those bring your kids to work days. It was bring your keffiyeh to work and have as many people as possible wearing a keffiyeh at work as a visible show of solidarity. And that became the one day that management said, because they said we have no problem with people wearing keffiyehs apart from on the day that the unions say to do it. And which then kind of escalates things in terms of what we do. And we did bring our keffiyehs to work on that day, and people wear them. But then it became management telling us that we were intimidating people. And I suppose what I'm trying to get round is, first of all, how we try and tackle that dynamic in a workplace setting. But I was also, I mean, you know, I was enthralled by both the speakers actually, and it made me think, like, after the murder of George Floyd, I got a whole load of speakers in, you know, to different union meetings, including, you know, really quite radical revolutionary speakers talking about how we smash the system to achieve black liberation. I think we probably have to try and think of ways of going on the front foot a bit around this as well, in terms of actually bringing the radical Jewish tradition into our workplaces, as well as the Palestinian liberation arguments. And I haven't quite worked out exactly how we do it, apart from maybe getting one of the speakers to come in and speak to the union meeting, which I'm sure management will try and ban. You know, so working ways around that. But I just think I'd be really interested to hear other ideas that people have of how we do try and kind of rebuild some of that, but do it in the places where...
And one of the really interesting things that have come out of the rise in these pro-Palestinian protests is talking to people who are raised Zionist, who talk about how there's a language of dehumanization towards Muslims and how Israel positions itself, you know, fighting the fight against these animal, rabid, brown people who have this violent religion, you know, that dehumanizes Jewish people. And, you know, I think there's been a push among the Muslims in the pro-Palestinian movement as well to try and examine any sort of internalized anti-Semitism. The difficulty is, though, that it seems that mentioning anti-Semitism is now sort of being framed as a form of anti-Semitism. If we say, you know, Israel has positioned itself as an exceptional state, as a wealthy state, that it's aligned with the far right, that in many ways it replicates what the Nazis have done to the Holocaust victims, that in itself is now being positioned as a form of anti-Semitism. And I recognize that this is just bullshit rhetoric to waste our time, but I do wonder if there's a sort of better pedagogy or a sort of better way for, you know, Jewish allies to sort of talk about these things, apart from shutting people down when they're on their bullshit. But yes, I just sort of thought I wanted to contribute that as well.
Thank you. So.
I love Barnaby talking about the Catholic Church. When I was brought up in a very devout Catholic family, I was an altar boy, and at the end of church, at the end of the Mass, they used to end by saying, "Let us pray for the conversion of the Jews." And it was deeply
that the Jews were the other, that the Jews were the murderers of Christ. And you know, it was only in the mid-60s that they changed the prayer to say, "Let us pray for the conversion of Russia." So I think that's something that we seem to forget, how deeply ingrained it is. And I want to say the tragedy of it today, as a result of the weaponisation of anti-Semitism, it is profoundly divisive. In my own experience, working within the Teachers' Union in Islington, one of my best friends, who was very, very prominent on the far left of the union, we were having dinner together after the whole furore around Corbyn and all the rest of it, and she turned around to me and said, "Well, he is an anti-Semite." And you know, I was shocked beyond belief, and there was no evidence, no proof. It is deeply ingrained that the ruling ideas of the ruling are the ideas of the ruling class, even when they are lies, and it is so deeply rooted. You know, it has to be rooted out through the way in which Liz and Anna has said. The last point is this, following on from what Liz said, that we had a meeting in Oxford the other night, 250 people. Avi Schlein, the great Jewish intellectual, spoke and was by far the sharpest and best speaker. Donny's dad and Anna's dad, the same person, Tony Cliff, you know, turned me, you know, who was formerly a devout Catholic, into a revolutionary socialist. We've got to give the radical Jewish voices the voice that they need to have to respond to the current situation where anti-Semitism is being weaponised, and I really welcome the introduction that both Johnny and Barnaby have given this evening.
Obviously, it's quite clearly reject whenever it's brought up. You know, we can see so clearly in the history of Israel how it is not at all within the Jewish tradition, which I think is both talked about a lot better than I could spend the words myself. But you know, the fact that, you know, right after October 7th did happen, who are the people that immediately jumped to go and support Israel? It's people like Cyril O'Brien or Elon Musk, who are both
deeply, deeply anti-Semitic people. I mean, you saw the week before October 7th, that Suella Braverman was in the United States giving talks about great replacement theory. Elon Musk himself has also clearly just posted about that on Twitter, constantly, time after time after time. And I think we always need to be quite clear when we're talking about this, that what we're seeing isn't a religious conflict whatsoever, but instead an imperialist conflict, right? It's not something driven by, the differing ideologies or anything. It is a direct result of the West wanting to have some sort of bastion of control in the Middle East, right? So they can have all control of oil and trade routes and everything like that. And I think the reason that it's so important that we put those arguments forward, in the Palestine movement as well, is because if we don't put those arguments forward, saying that we're opposed to Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, like the other speaker was saying as well, then the people that are joining all these circles, hearing these arguments and everything, they're not going to be hearing that. And a lot of the time, where else are they going to look to when they're talking about Palestine and everything? They're going to go online, where there are a lot of bad arguments put out there as well that aren't going to talk about how it's imperialism at the root of this, but they're instead going to come across other bad ideas about how this is happening because of some Israeli lobby that's controlling courts and parliaments over here, or the idea of huge blocks of Jewish voters in the US that need to be appealed to, which at the end of the day, all of these go back to a really anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish people controlling society and everything. If we don't put forward a serious argument about how it's not down to that, then people aren't going to fall into those arguments. And fundamentally, if we are seeing anti-Semitism on the rise, that increases Islamophobia and vice versa, because fundamentally one racist poison is all kinds of racist poison, and they all go back to bolster each other, but I'll wrap up there.
Yet, I've been away for 2 weeks. I took it with me, thinking I would get it finished, and discovered that I needed to pay much more attention to it than I thought I had, because I realised that I knew absolutely nothing. I kind of started reading it thinking I knew very little, but then found out that I knew even less than I thought I did, which meant I haven't quite read as much as I have. But I really would recommend the book to people, because it is such a tiny book, and I'm sure that for lots of you here are going to learn a great deal from it that you didn't know before. But also, I'm reading the book, I'm also thinking about what Liz said, because you took the words out of my mouth, Liz, when you said, how do we celebrate the radical Jewish tradition more? How do we make sure that everybody gets to know about this the fantastic record that Jewish people have for fighting oppression all around the world? And so, yes, I really just want to echo Liz's question, the importance of coming away tonight with at least some ideas
within the book, and how actually constantly we have to fight to reclaim that radical tradition and to do away with that notion. Not only is it deeply anti-Semitic in and of itself, and not something that begins and ends just with the history of the Holocaust, but I think it's incredibly rich, and actually going beyond just maybe some of the few examples of resistance like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 43, but actually there was lots of stuff that I didn't know about the resistance that Jews had to Nazi Germany. And I think it's an incredibly important thing to remember about Jews not having this sort of passivity that is often taught to us in schools. Actually, the only time I ever learned about resistance to the Holocaust was from my grandfather, never from my teachers or from the textbooks. And he used to speak to me about, he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and about, not in the uprising, but about that tradition and how angry it made him. Really the way in which that history is spoken about. And I think it reminds me of something that Barnaby said about how everything that we see in Israel is not in the Jewish tradition, but much of it reminds us of Jewish history. And I think actually you could accuse Netanyahu or those who want to charge anybody who speaks out about anti-Zionism as an anti-Semite with accusing Jews of that sort of same passivity. If you think of the kind of new form of anti-Semitism that people have spoken about that's been weaponised against people like Corbyn, which really brings about this myth of the collective Jew, right, as though we are all represented by a state. And I think, I don't have time to go into the absolute ridiculousness that a state like the State of Israel could be attributed like human traits, as though it could experience racism in the same way that any Jew or any Muslim or anybody could experience. But I think actually, you know, it falls victim to that same thing that so many radical and socialist Jews have been trying to break out of, that we are not a homogenous group, nor are we passive. And actually, I'm proud, you know, to stand on a platform, but also, you know, on demonstrations in rooms of socialist Jews who stand in a long and rich tradition and actually have an understanding that an injury to one is an injury to all. And that is why, you know, not only do we fight against the ongoing genocide in Palestine, but against all forms of racism from the Tory government and across the world. But I actually went, after everybody being so polite and keeping to time, I was the one who went on the most. That's it.
About trying to group things in two themes. How we think about what is distinctively Jewish, and how we think about the challenges of anti-Semitism today. And I'll try and be brief on the first, because the second is the really thorny thing that is difficult to talk about and that we have to. So firstly, what I tried to stress about what I think of as the distinctive Jewish contribution to radicalism and to the left is this point about being awkwardly related to nation states. This thing about being a transnational community, which therefore has so often pushed against the nationalist tendencies that have defined the right wing of socialist politics in Britain and elsewhere. It is to be in the term that Stalin used about us and that David Ben-Gurion then used again about Jews outside Israel, derisively, rootless cosmopolitans, right? To be people, and of course, to be Jewish is not to be rootless. It is to be rooted in thousands of years of history and tradition. It is to be rooted in the contemporary communities that we build, multiracial, multi-ethnic communities, of which we are proud. It is to be rooted in the crap Brick Lane bagel shop that's still open and a much better one that's recently, surprisingly, been closed down. It is to have deep roots, but Stalin identified us as rootless because he meant you're not rooted in the nation and its bureaucracy and its state apparatus. And that's what Ben-Gurion meant when he told Isaac Deutsche, who was slightly puzzled and said, "You sound like the anti-Semitic Stalin." When David Ben-Gurion said, "You're rootless if you're not rooted in this settler mentality of the settler and the soldier in the Zionist state." That's not distinctive to Jews. If you read Huey Newton's great intercommunalism essay, you'll see that he draws the same lesson about the reason that blacks in America have been so central to the vanguard of the American left, because he says we were deprived of our membership in any national community and are therefore instinctive internationalists, he says. It's not unique to Jews, but it is important. You know, I should mention, since we're here, I believe that your father, Cliff, was stateless for his whole life. And it's a striking thing about, you know, when you hear recordings and whatever of Cliff, that he never seemed to try to moderate his accent. And I think of that as an important political, I don't know if it was deliberate or if he was just unable to, but I think it's an important political statement, right? I will be a leader of British socialism and I will not pretend to be a Brit. And indeed, if I'm permitted one rude joke about Trotskyism, the four Trotskyist traditions in Britain, right? You've got Rabbi Cliff, Rabbi Mandel, Rabbi Grant, and the fourth, the WRP had an Irishman, and it didn't go so well. So Jews are very important to radical politics, and if you don't have them, things go badly. But I don't mean that, I promise. But I want to raise two correctives, because the story of the Seder of Pesach was mentioned, the Passover. And I think there's two correctives to that story that I think are very helpful for us in thinking about what kinds of political community we want to construct and the promises and the pitfalls of Jewish community. Two correctives from Edward Said. One is famously in his introduction to Freud on Moses and monotheism, where Said says, look, if Moses was really a revolutionary, he shouldn't have left Egypt, he should have stayed and transformed it. And the second was in his response to the awful pseudo-leftist Michael Walzer, who wrote a book about Exodus. Said wrote a response called Exodus, A Canaanite Perspective, in which he says, look, the enslaved Israelites in Egypt seem very radical when they're seeking freedom from slavery, but then what do? They go somewhere else, and it's briefly mentioned that they seem to wage a war and kick out the people who live in that holy land when they get there. And it's always seemed to me that membership in a kind of political community that takes inspiration from Jewish history is celebration of that moment of the Exodus where Moses chooses to identify as a Jew, bear in mind he's raised as an Egyptian prince, chooses to identify as a Jew in what moment? In the moment when he sees a slave driver beating up a Jew, and because Jews are not Christians, we don't turn the other cheek. He grabs that slave driver and kills him with his bare hands. And that is the moment of identification with the oppressed in which Moses declares himself effectively a Jew. And when the Jews leave Mitzrayim, leave Egypt, it's not just the Jews who leave. We're told in the Bible, a mixed multitude. Others, oppressed and exploited in Egyptian society, choose to go with them. That's the moment of the construction of political community through experiences of oppression, domination, slavery, and so on. That's the moment of the construction of political community in which a Jewish experience of being marginalized plays a central role. I want to be able to affirm that, and not as a tribalist would, to affirm also the moment of the ethnic cleansing that then follows. I want to be able to reject that moment, to say, in other words, my identification with the Jewish radical tradition is not to say Jews right or wrong, but it's to say Jewish history has given us resources for a politics of solidarity that may sometimes depart us from the company of many Jews who choose not to stand in that tradition. And that is the same as people from other historically oppressed communities who refuse offers of safety and security, false offers of safety from ruling classes. That's the kind of move that we make. Okay, so how to face anti-Semitism today? The important thing, I think, is that we live in a new world and we have to be honest about it. A very changed world, and we have to be honest about it. Anti-Semitism is a term coined in the late 19th century in Germany. It's Wilhelm Marr, German journalist, at a moment of lurid Orientalism. It was coined in the 1870s at a moment of obsessive fascination with the Arab world, and the designation of Jews as Semites works precisely to identify us with Arabs. That is to say, people liminally related to European civilization, not imagined like Africans were in the racist imaginary as peoples without history, but imagined instead as people problematically in the pores of European civilization. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I know that I'm running out of time, so all I do is speed up and don't say anything less. I'm so sorry. So in our construction as Semite, I'm going to do it again, I'm sorry. I'll try. In our construction as Semites, Jews were imagined, like Arabs, as people liminally related, insider outsiders of European civilization, who threatened to bring down the whole civilization. That was the terrifying image of Jews. Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky, and so on. Today, Jews are imagined in the predominant discourse of British society as a kind of protected minority of Western civilization, threatened by the savage hordes who would bring down that civilization. I always think, the example I always use, we're imagined a little bit like white women in the Jim Crow South, right, where the lynching of black men is legitimated through the claim that they're violent threats to white women who are a vulnerable population that you have to defend and protect. That, I think, is how Jews are imagined today, and that's a big change. So when they talk about anti-Semitism of old today, they talk about Rothschild, but they don't talk about Trotsky, right? Because Jews are now imagined, Siobhan McDonough, the idiot Labour MP, said anti-capitalism is necessarily anti-Semitic because Jews are rich, and so on, she says, right? So Jews are imagined by these people as representatives of power, of Western colonial and class power. This is the anti-Semitic imaginary that these supposedly anti-Semites hold, these Philo-Semites. There's an old Yiddish joke, you'll know. The Philo-Semite is the anti-Semite who loves Jews, right? So Jews are imagined as holders of class and imperial power and as attacked by Palestinians, Arabs, the whole of the global south, any of the left. That is the imaginary of the so-called new anti-Semitism. There are two bad responses to that, at least. I've only got time for two. One bad response to that is from David Miller et al., which treats Jews who are being mobilized by Western society in this way as, in fact, the authors of that process. Right? Now, it's entirely true that there's a very powerful Israel lobby and they do lots of damage, and David Miller's right about that. But when he says that Chabad Lubavitch, a Hasidic sect, is a major international organizing center of Western imperial power, he's guilty of this problem, right? Of seeing Jews who are in fact being used by Western imperial power for this end as instead the genius authors of the process. That's one bad response to this new process. The second bad response to this new process is from Jews saying this position really gives us safety. And so we must endorse this position and see the threats to us as overwhelmingly, and everyone in this room who's brought up in a kind of mainstream Jewish home knows this, to see that anti-Semitism as overwhelmingly therefore coming from the poorer and darker people of the world, and the ludicrous situation where our religious, supposedly communal leadership bodies line up behind the British monarchy. Prince William was just the other day doing something for the United States, line up behind the British monarchy, behind the Conservative Party, behind all these people who've always hated Jews. Prince William's beloved grandmother, as a little girl, did the Nazi salute and was photographed doing it, right? Obviously, these people hate Jews. But we're told that these people are our friends and allies, our protectors against the poorer and darker people of the world. We have to be honest about the fact that that is a serious ideological shift in conceptions of what anti-Semitism is. When I knocked on a door in the 2019 election and a man with tattoos and Union Jack tattoos opened the door and said he wouldn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn because Jeremy Corbyn likes immigrants and hates Jews, right? I don't think that man's understanding of anti-Semitism was not mine. Anti-Semitism to him meant the virus carried by darker and browner people. And that understanding has achieved some level of hegemony in Jewish worlds, and it's difficult to engage. And I think we have to rethink how we engage it. You know, people in this room will know that, for example, UAF historically had a position, I think Stand Up to Racism has a position of not taking a position on Israel in order to maintain unity. But I think that's difficult now, as we see an increasingly genocidal project that many people around the world oppose. And we need a different conception of what anti-Semitism is. We're in the phrase that we use, I've spent most of the last few months trying to build a Jewish left. And the phrase that my comrades in my organisation use is that we face a battle for the soul of the Jewish people. You know, next Friday, a week today, there are going to be 2 big Shabbat dinners held. The chief rabbi is holding a special Shabbat for Israel. And so we're holding a Shabbat for Palestine, bringing together people as we've been doing for the last few dinners we've been holding, hundreds of people, to push a conception of Jewishness and of Judaism that is not tied to colonial violence, that is not tied to genocide, but instead stands for universal human freedom. But in doing that, we have to persuade Jews and to acknowledge that it is difficult to persuade Jews, that we are not protected by our mobilization as human shields for an increasingly violent imperial civilization, which is Western imperialism, thank God, on the decline. We shouldn't hitch our wagons to that declining violent project. And it's difficult to persuade Jews of that. And we should fight anti-Semitism and defend Jews regardless of their position on Israel. Of course, that's right. But should also, I think, be honest about the challenge that anti-Semitism will continue to rise as long as it is cynically positioned by Western imperialism. Jews are cynically positioned, Israel is cynically positioned, anti-Semitism is cynically positioned as their battering ram to allow them to attack, especially Muslims. That is a cauldron, is a burning fire in which Jews will continue to be in danger, and we have to smash that condition in order to have safety for Jews and, thank God, freedom for everyone. That's the tough argument I think we have to make.
I want to talk about the question, what do we mean by Jewish? There's two ways to do this. The first thing to say is it's a social construct. It's not what the Nazis said. If you've got a Jewish grandfather or a Jewish grandmother, you've got a quarter, then you are Jewish. And it's not a biological, it's to do with a social construct. And where does that social construct come from? From 2 sources. Number 1, the society. You have a little bit of a different religion, therefore we're going to oppress you, and that forms a bit of your identity. And the other form, that part of what makes you Jewish, is the fighting back. You resist. In the past, when the oppression came along, you got these messianic movements in the Jewish community. Sabbato Zvi and Hasidism, etc., etc. When people put under pressure, they said, I'm proud of my religion and I'm sticking with it. That was a Jewish identity then. In the middle of the 19th century, that Jewish identity breaks down because Jews are mixing with other people, and you've got loads of... Basically, there is no single Jewish identity. There are Orthodox Jews, as I said. There are assimilated Jews. There are Bundist Jews who are sort of socialists but a bit nationalist. There are revolutionary Marxist Jews who are... There's not a single one, just like there's not one... We don't believe in races. We don't believe that there's a single Jewish race. But what we do believe and what we do understand is that society defines people as such, and we fight back, and you have that identification. So it's complex. It's complex, and it's more complex for Jews than anybody else because they live all over the world. You know, if you're living in one country, it would be relatively easy to do. So the answer is it's complex, but it's a social construct. Moving on, the question, Sheila disagreed with the surveys. The surveys suggest, and I haven't asked everybody in the country who's Jewish, but the survey suggests that something like 60 to 70% of Jewish people in this country identify themselves as Zionists. If you say, are you a Zionist? 60 to 70% will say that. 90%, this is probably out of date, these are from 6-7 years ago. 90% will defend the existence of the State of Israel. Right? So, I wish that wasn't the case, but it is the case. The one that really worries me is, well, those do worry me, but the one that really worries me is that 67% of Jews vote Tory. Right? The effect of Stalinism, of the Hitler and the things I described that destroyed the Jewish tradition also affected the way that people think. And so, when people talked about the Holocaust, it has an impact. Unfortunately, it does. That doesn't mean that the battle is lost. So that in terms of that, I'm afraid that's what the statistics say, and I'm afraid that probably is the situation. I want to talk about anti-Semitism itself. There's a real anti-Semitism and there's a phony one. The real anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews for being Jewish. If you want to find the person who carried it out, Adolf Hitler was the example. He didn't care whether you were Zionist, anti-Zionist, whatever, religious, non-religious. He labelled people and said, you are Jewish, and that's it. So that I think is real anti-Semitism. There's a phony one, and it's a racist trope that says all Jews think the same. All Jews, and this is what I need to counter the thing I just said about the statistics, all Jews think the same. Therefore, if you disagree with Israel, you're not really Jewish. That's what happened in the Labour Party, remember? Those people that agreed with the existence of Israel and all the rest of it were allowed to be Jewish. Jewish voice for Labour? No, you're not Jewish. You're not allowed to be. So that's a phony, and we just don't accept that one. What we say is, no, this is not what it's about. It's the right. Look at the history. It's the right that always have been pushing anti-Semitism. It's imperialism that is pushing the existence of Israel, etc., etc. We are anti-racist, and that means anti-racist against anti-Semitism and against Islamophobia and so on and so forth. And that takes me on to the final point. The very, very important questions that people ask about, what do you do about it? What do you do about it? And the answer is, and this is what Jews did in the past, the radical Jews, they didn't start off with, I'm Jewish and therefore that's my starting point. The starting point was, I'm oppressed, you're exploited, how can we overcome this problem? By unity. Think about the terms divide and rule. That's what it's all about, divide and rule. What's the opposite of divide and rule? Unity and overcoming. That's what we need to do. And how do we do that? Well, you've got an opportunity on the 16th of March, right? Because on the 16th of March, we'll be marching against racism, against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, against the witch hunts against refugees, and so on and so forth. And that is the solution. That's what radical Jewish tradition was in the past. Karl Marx didn't say, I'm Jewish and therefore I'm going to stand for that. Or, I'm with the workers, but I'm not interested in oppression. Workers of the world unite, absolutely. Friedrich Engels against women's oppression, the origin of the family, etc., etc. It's about that unity of fighting against the system, and we cannot fight against the system which creates the racism against Jews, against Muslims, against refugees. We can't fight it unless we fight against the oppression, against the ways that they try to divide us. So, the answer is, and it's not easy, Barnaby laid it out, it's not easy, there's an argument to be done, but the argument is, if you want to fight anti-Semitism, come on the march with us on March the 16th. If you want to fight these things, come on the march. Don't privilege your situation over somebody else and say, well, that's nothing to do with me. We stand for refugees wherever they come from. We stood for them in the 1930s, where they were Jewish. We stand for them now when they're coming from Syria or Iraq or wherever. So that's the answer. It's not easy.